Can face-to-face diplomacy diffuse economic rivalry? Chinese President Xi Jinping met EU leaders in Beijing on Thursday for a high-stakes summit marking 50 years of diplomatic ties. But behind the handshakes are deep divisions over rare earths, tariffs, and technology access. Is this the end of engagement or just hardball diplomacy? I'm Alican Ayanlar, and today's Newsmaker is the EU-China Summit. President Xi Jinping hosted Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa in Beijing on Thursday in a meeting meant to commemorate a half-century of EU-China relations. But this wasn't a celebration. It was crisis management. Europe came with a list of grievances, from China's overproduction and restricted market access to fears of overdependence on Chinese critical minerals. Beijing, in turn, pushed back on what it sees as Europe's alignment with U.S. containment. And yet, both sides still need each other for trade, for technology, and for global stability. Can this relationship be rebalanced, or are some of the world's biggest economies headed for an era of managed rivalry? Here's more on the story.
What was meant to be a celebration of 50 years of diplomacy instead exposed the deepening fault lines between Brussels and Beijing. From trade to geopolitics, and a war reshaping Europe's borders, tensions defined this year's EU-China Summit in Beijing. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa arrived with a pointed message. Imbalance can no longer define engagement.
As our cooperation has deepened, so have the imbalances. We have reached an inflection point. Rebalancing our bilateral relations is essential, because to be sustainable, the relations need to be mutually beneficial.
The EU's trade deficit with China now exceeds 300 billion euros. At the core, what Brussels sees as unfair competition, with subsidised Chinese goods crowding out European industries, especially in the green tech sector. But this isn't just about vehicles, it's about control over the industries of the future. Europe is demanding reliable access to critical raw materials, accusing Beijing of using its dominance in rare earths as geopolitical leverage. President Xi acknowledged tensions, but urged a different path.
The more complex and challenging the international situation becomes, the more China and Europe need to strengthen communication and deepen cooperation, so as to contribute greater stability to the world through a healthy China-Europe relationship.
But for EU leaders, stability requires action, especially in Ukraine. They say it's time for China to step off the sidelines and turn its close ties with Moscow into real leverage.
As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, we call on China to use its influence on Russia to respect the United Nations Charter and to bring an end to its war on aggression against Ukraine.
Beijing has refused to condemn the invasion, claiming neutrality even as it expands economic ties with the Kremlin. And as political trust fades, analysts warn economic progress may also stall.
European Union-China comprehensive agreement on investment was agreed on and signed, but it wasn't ratified by the European Parliament. So it's a homework for the European Union to go on in the ratification process by the European Parliament, to convince the members of European Parliament that it's in the interest of European consumers to get affordable, high-quality Chinese product.
Despite tensions, the two sides did find one area of agreement: a joint climate statement reaffirming their commitment to the Paris Agreement and the upcoming COP30 talks, one of the day's few moments of unity. The summit marked years of EU-China relations. But in a world changed by power plays and proxy wars, the next 50 may not be so easy to navigate.
Joining me now are from Maryland, Senior Fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies, Sourabh Gupta. From Beijing, Senior Fellow over at the Taihe Institute, Einar Tangen. And from Berlin, Jean Monet Professor in European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin, Ulrich Bruckner. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Lovely to have you on. Ulrich, let me begin with you. I mean, this summit was supposed to mark a half-century of diplomatic ties, but as we know, it was cut short and lots of thorny issues loom. What's your assessment?
Well, what we have seen before is already a chain of events that made it very difficult to come out with a spectacular result. So the expectations have been very modest, given that the European Union was playing with different perspectives on, shall we rather focus on the partnership China is needed for economic reasons and also to find a common solution to deal with climate change. At the same time, they are competitors and they compete under different conditions because they operate as different players with different operation systems. And last but not least, they are systemic rivals. And it's extremely difficult if you move in one direction to find a common result in something else. That made it extremely complicated, and that's why we see what we see.
Okay, fair enough. Einar, let me turn to you. Ulrich said they're operating with different perspectives. Keeping this in mind, I mean, does Beijing see Europe as perhaps inconsistent? I mean, it's demanding cooperation, but at the same time, aligning itself perhaps with U.S. containment. How does China interpret the tone from the European Union?
Well, I mean, the Europeans are very proud. Their colonial past is something different perspective, perhaps, within Europe than outside it. But the fact is, China is not interested in a Europe that, at the same time as it's demanding economic cooperation, is aligning with the U.S. To contain it. Now, faced with very steep tariffs, having been bullied by Trump and talked down to by J.D. Vance, they're in a very, very difficult position. The question is, how pragmatic are they willing to be? They keep bringing up these issues. They keep saying that China is enabling the war in Ukraine. They bring up human rights issues. These are all not the kind of things that you want to bring up if you're trying to achieve some sort of positive goal. But as I said, Europe is very proud. They think it's their moral responsibility and right, despite their past, to make these pronouncements. And it does, it strikes Beijing as hypocritical.
Okay. Sourabh, let's get you in the conversation. I mean, you've said that China could have done more to engage with the European Union. So why didn't it?
More a case of mismatched expectations. When Trump, during the first term, China-U.S. relations really went down right towards the end of that first term, and China jumped on the bandwagon and wanted to deepen its ties with the European Union, and they did manage to have an agreement in principle on called the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was a very major deal. But I think the bottom fell out thereafter with COVID-19 and with genocide declared in Xinjiang, et cetera, et cetera. And the EU was close with Mr. Biden, including against China in some respects. And this didn't go down terribly well with China. Now, Mr. Trump has come and he is not treating the Europeans as a partner, let alone as an ally. And the Europeans want to get their relationship with China moving. While China is letting the China-EU relationship kind of stew for a while, I think China can do a lot more on the economic front, on the trade, investment, and economic front. I think the distance between their respective economic policies, particularly in the industrial policy area, can be narrowed. And for that to happen, I think much of the onus is on China. But China is not yet showing that it is forthcoming in doing so. Perhaps it will be later because it's in its own interest too. But I think it's this sort of neither of them is looking at each other immediately at this point of time as a close partner, while
Okay.
there is some degree of maneuvering happening in this trilateral relation, the three-way relationship. And we'll have to see where this goes forward, because at the end of the day, I would say China wants a deep interdependent relationship with the EU, but it cannot be only on China's terms. And in fact, it needs to move a lot more towards the EU's terms on the trade and investment side.
Sourabh, let's actually shift gears for a moment and actually look into one of the sticking points. I mean, let me ask you, I mean, you feel that the EU should continue relying on Chinese rare earth minerals, or does this summit prove that it's time to diversify the supply chains and reduce the dependency?
That was always the case, to reduce the dependency up to a point. As China, as the EU itself says, there is the need for de-risking, particularly of what are essentially strategic commodities. Europe has talked a good game for the last 3-4 years. It's not really played or done much about it. We see Mr. Trump, in fact, actually doing a lot more on this front, trying to negotiate ceasefires in Africa so he can have access to mineral resources. This is something the Europeans need to do. They need to go out and find access to their own resources, build up certain amount of processing capacity. Remember, at the end of the day, China has dominance in the sector, and China's goal is not really necessarily, definitely, I'd say, with the Europeans, to weaponize it. But China wants to maintain that dominance, and it will, if it comes to that, try to manipulate the price so that this industry cannot grow in these other major economic areas. But the onus is on the Europeans to try to surmount that barrier, even as it seeks access from China on raw materials, which it is now getting through that green channel. But I think the Europeans themselves have talked a lot about it, not done as much about it. And
Okay.
as they themselves say, in certain areas, they don't want to decouple. Just do some degree of strategic de-risking. And this is as good an area as where they should be doing and have not done enough.
Okay. Einar, I want to get your perspective on this. I mean, you've argued that China's rare earth leverage is about integration and not really about confrontation. But if the EU keeps pushing tariffs and technology bans its way, the question is, why should China cooperate at all?
Well, I mean, there are good reasons to cooperate, but I disagree with my good friend Sourabh. This idea that somehow China has to move towards the EU is nonsense. It's both sides have to move towards a middle. You cannot be saying somebody, you're evil and we have to compete against you, and everything you do we don't like in terms of we believe you're committing human rights atrocities, although they have no basis for that other than CIA reports. This is not going to help. So this idea that one side or the other side has to move is nonsense. They have to come together. I mean, when you have von der Leyen go shortly before saying, China's enabling a war it never wanted, that was very destructive to his own relationship, I completely disagree. So right now, there are good reasons for China to cooperate with Europe. Both feel very strongly about climate change, about having a green economy. If Europe is going to be energy independent and stop buying gas at 3 times the price of pipe gas because it's LNG from the US, it needs to go to renewables. And China has those. But instead of saying, look, we want to buy as much cheap solar and wind power as we possibly can so that we can rebuild our economy, they're blaming China and saying, you're doing a bad thing. I don't know how that's a bad thing, getting it at the cheapest price possible. You might say that it's dampening your industries, but the fact is China is way ahead of them. And in terms of those rare earths, that's a pipe dream. This idea that you're going to suddenly start competing with China is nonsense. China does 70% of the materials and 90% of the processing. The reason it does the processing is because it has the best process. It's 10 to 15 years, according to industry insiders, ahead of any other country in terms of the processing, and processing is critical. You have to get it down to the purity levels where it's operationally useful. This isn't something like horseshoes or hand grenades where you get it almost correct and it works out. You're talking about minuscule, tiny transistors, and they're being doped with this stuff. This is not something you can just throw out there. So this idea that you're suddenly going to compete with China in the next 6 months, nonsense. You could do it over a 10 to 15-year period if you apply a lot of muscle power and also brain power, but this isn't going to happen. So this idea that China is using rare earths to leverage Europe into anything is nonsense. They're not trying to weaponize it. They just simply want to come together, have a cooperative relationship, start talking, taking care of the things that Donald Trump is ignoring, like health, the environment, etc.
Ulrich, Europe says it wants to de-risk and not decouple. So does this sort of fall in line with what Einar just said in terms of, come meet me in the middle?
Well, it is what the European Union has been saying for a long time, but it really didn't bring much to the table. And if I listen to my colleague in Beijing, it sounds as if the Europeans are stubborn children who haven't fully understood what's going on, and they are massively emotionalized about everything. It is about interests. And when we look at the last few years, everything has been securitized. And the European Union painfully understood that dependencies, even if the other side says this will never be weaponized, has been turned against the European Union. So there is a reason why what makes sense economically or to address climate change is something that has been carefully looked at to avoid forms of dependencies that can literally block supply chains and even more. And this is why everything is much more complicated than let's stop your pride or let's be less emotional, then everything is fine. There is so much of mutual dependencies that we find a lot of middle ground if both sides are interested in a constructive dialogue. This will not be a revolution, but I'm pretty sure that there is a lot both sides can do without giving up their interests.
Einar, I want to give a chance to you to respond to what Ulrich just said.
Yeah, I didn't say that it was an emotional, it's ideological. Europe feels very strongly that they're in the right on all things, though they're very late to the table on Gaza. They feel that Ukraine was something that every country had to join in on. So this idea that it's an emotional tantrum is nonsense. They both have interests. They have common interests. They need to move together. And I will take him up on his first point that Europe brought nothing or very, very little to the table, just a few insults. This was a disappointment. It moved from a two-day event to a one-day event. They didn't have the kind of coordinating meeting that you generally have ahead of time, so it wasn't going to be taken seriously. But the Chinese are not in the mood to be having insults hurled at them, saying that they are abusing their own people when they start looking at what Europe and America are doing to theirs. It's not a game of whataboutism. It's just China is the one who's getting rid of extreme poverty. They're the ones who are putting in the infrastructure. They're the ones who are exceeding at many, many technological points that are improving the lives of people here. So this idea that they just don't like it when Europeans come in with a superior attitude and say, well, you're not doing very well. Okay, well, I think their attitude is very simple. Show us how you're doing better.
Let me, since you mentioned Europe and America together, I mean, essentially Beijing is accusing the EU of preaching sort of multilateralism on one hand while practicing protectionism. I mean, are the officials in Beijing, do they believe that Europe still has strategic autonomy, or has it essentially become a proxy of Washington?
Well, this is kind of the moment where we're going to see how does the EU deal with Donald Trump's unilateral tariffs. I don't think any country in the world believes that they're getting a fair shake, including the penguins on that island who are trying to figure out how many fish they have to give them. So, at this point, Europe can make its own fate. And I'm not saying that they abandon their principles or their governance or anything like that. But what they have to do is come to the table seriously, stop throwing, mud balls at the Chinese prior to the time that you want to negotiate with them. I think that's fairly obvious. You don't spit on somebody and then try to ask them to shake your hand.
Sourabh, you reject the idea that globalization is dead, but can the trade between the European Union and China survive this era of values-based competition and sort of economic nationalism?
Yes, I absolutely think so, simply because the interests are so strong and so large. Yes, globalization has been securitized to a very significant extent. There's no doubt about it by all the major actors. But at the same time, if one separates and takes the United States out of this equation, you actually find all the other major actors deepening their relationships. I mean, it's whether the EU and Japan would sign an economic partnership agreement. In Asia, you have the CPTPP and the RCEP agreements. EU is trying to do an agreement with the Mercosur countries. As I said, of course, the EU and China had their comprehensive agreement on investment. Of course, one needs to move beyond that. But they are looking for a deepened interdependence in ties, because as they say very often, and I think they genuinely mean it, they do see the multilateral system has provided very significant dividends to poor and rich countries alike. China has risen on the back of that globalization and multilateralism, and it knows that it needs to do the necessary structural reforms on the trade and investment front, which will take it to the next level to really become a dominating player in many industries. Now, the fact of the matter is that China wants, as I said, to rise up the value chain, but the means in which it is going about doing it, at least to the Europeans, seems to be an unfair process. That's why when they keep talking about competitor, it's about having a level playing field. They're not looking for sweetheart market purchases deals like Mr. Trump is looking. They're talking in terms of level playing field, because the experience of EU companies in China has been that they come out there is some element of technology transfer. Once the Chinese have a comparable product in many of these advanced manufacturing sectors, the effect thereafter is that through discrimination, procurement barriers, and other barriers, the Europeans are essentially elbowed out of those sectors. And this has happened in rail, it's happening in medical devices, and that's why the Europeans have now started utilizing their own coercive instruments like the foreign subsidy regime and procurement instrument against the Chinese, so as to kind of level the playing field. I think China understands the importance of this leveling from its own standpoint, because industrial policy has succeeded, but on rather wasteful terms, and they want to become more efficient. So at the end of the day, I think both committed to multilateralism, both committed to interdependence, but at the same time finding ways to de-risk their relationship so that there are no real critical strategic dependencies on either side.
Ulrich, let me ask you very quickly. I mean, we've been talking about sort of the summits in a slightly sort of non-positive aspect. Any positives to take from this?
Well, of course, if there are summits and they have to come home with a positive result, there is an interest on both sides to find a common denominator. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that the European Union is not the same as Trump or Xi. The European Union is a much more decentralized system in which it is extremely complicated for Ursula von der Leyen or Costa as the president of the council to speak on the same level as a president of the Communist Party or the president of the United States of America. There is so much going on behind the scene, and the interests of the different member states make it extremely complicated to find a position. That is why it's difficult to hold meetings before that are the same as if the Communist Party is doing this.
Ulrich, thank you. Einar, I want to give you the last word and final thoughts. I mean, you said that Europe must choose partner or rival. I mean, when you look at the summit, does it push the EU closer to China or to confrontation?
Well, I don't think either. I mean, the fact is that it's a reality, and I do agree with Sourabh. There's interconnectedness that is not going to be escaped. both for China and the EU. I mean, if you look at what China has done with the Belt and Road initiatives, guess where they all kind of headed towards? Europe. There's never an intention to do it. I mean, in terms of China's competitiveness, yes, that is a problem. But it's a problem for the US and EU for many, many years, sold on brand. They didn't bother to be as consumer focused. Now, all of a sudden, it's industrial policy that stands in the way instead of China's ability to be more efficient. But you know, at the end of the day, I'm hoping that they come together. This is not about dominance. China does not want to dominate other countries. They're not the US. And I think it's important to separate how civilizations think versus empires. The US is an empire. Europe was an empire. China is a civilization. They're trying to manage what they have and the relations that they have outside. Obviously, they have their perspective, but they're not trying to roll over anybody. They're not out there saying unilateral tariffs to people or my way or the highway. They simply said, let's have a constructive, civilized dialogue and figure this out.
Okay. Einar Tangen, Ulrich Bruckner, and Sourabh Gupta, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And thanks for watching. You can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Ulrich, and we'll see you next time.